Hey, what is up YouTube? Kolst here, and I'm here because 26.0.4, a new patch, has come out for Hearthstone with mainly a lot of different things, but mainly I'm going to be talking about the balance updates they made to Standard because of course that impacts Arena as well. And since I have been playing a lot more Standard recently, I will talk a little bit about that in the context of these changes as well, not just Arena, but still be mostly talking about how it impacts Arena. And by the way, I'll also take this chance to make the update to my tier list thing. Before this was the last version I had released, I'll make some very quick updates right now just to reflect a bit more accurately the current state. This was like a very early estimate, and just some changes. For example, like Priest is absolutely tier 1, Shaman's absolutely tier 1, Warrior and Demon Hunter are tier 2, and Rogue is tier 3. And this is how I viewed it until this most recent patch. But now, as there were some balance changes, there will be a few small changes I will make to this at the end of the video. But with that, let's go back to the patch notes. So the first major change we're going to talk about is that there was actually what they're calling here a system update. Basically, there's a change in the Discover rules, particularly for Death Knight. So what this change is that specifically any card that has 3 runes is not able to be discovered, period. So that means like, Triple Frost, Frostworm's Fury, a lot of the big win conditions in Blood, including Vampiric Blood that gain 10 health, and stuff like Grave Strength, Marrowgar, none of this is discoverable anymore. And that does include, for example, if you weren't aware, there is the Tri-Class Discover, Climactic Necrotic Explosion. That card was actually already undiscoverable, but now they're just making it more consistently, so none of these triple rune cards can be discovered. And so that is going to be pretty significant for Arena, because, for example, a big part of the reason you wanted to go double rune was to be able to get a 2 rune, or like something, for example, like an Unholy Discover, but so that you could hit Marrowgar, but you can no longer do that, so all of those class discovers are a bit worse. Amalgam as well is a bit worse. Discovering an Undead will no longer give you a lot of those big blood win conditions. So as a result, one thing about this is that you no longer really want to prioritize that stuff as high, so that makes going Rainbow in Arena quite a bit better, because now you're not really missing out as much anymore. Oh, and one thing to mention though that's very important is that the Scourge is not a triple rune card, so that's going to be still one of the big discovers in Unholy, but also from spell discovers, and it actually became a bit more likely because 4 of the other spells got removed. So I think it's a good thing. There's no more Marrowgars and stuff being discovered, but yeah, there's going to be even more Scourges. Not by a lot, but yeah, there's going to be even more of those. Oh, and one thing to mention, a minor detail about this as well, is that this does include RAM generation effects, which also does include, something like the Scourge. So the Scourge pool did get nerfed a little bit, at least, because yeah, some of those big things like Marrowgar and the 7/7 in Blood, you can't generate that anymore. So Scourge did get nerfed, if it's any consolation. But in any case, it is also worth mentioning that, there's things like Plague Rain, for example, that you actually didn't want. So it's not a strict nerf, but this is an overall nerf for sure for Death Knight. So it's going to hurt their power level by just a little bit. And with that, we'll move on to the card updates. There were a couple other nerfs, and then there were a whole lot of buffs. So the first card nerfed here is actually a neutral. It is Rowdy Fan. Rowdy Fan is working, it functions exactly the same way, but they're just reducing 1 attack from the combo. They particularly mentioned the Lady Stheno combo in Standard as a reason for that. But as well, as they mentioned, it's just a really, really efficient card for aggro decks. I actually tweeted about this myself because I was kind of losing my mind. I was like, how do people, how is this card not getting more attention? It's just so good in aggro. It just deals 4 damage face, and then it leaves a body. It's great, right? But in any case, it is being nerfed. It's still probably going to be playable at +3 attack for the same use as it was, but it is going to make it a bit worse. In an Arena, it wasn't a super premium neutral card even, so it's going to be a little bit harder to pick, but it's still a decent card by any means. It's not terrible. So with that, we'll move on to the next card nerfed, which is Overseer Frigidara. This was a 6-mana 5/6 that draws 2 spells. If they're both frost spells, deal 2 damage to all enemies. Now it's only going to be a 6-mana 3/6. Of course, making the body a bit worse, it just means if it sticks, it's just dealing less damage to the opponent. So it's a small nerf, but really, I mean, everyone who played this in Frost is still going to play this. No one is going to cut this card because of this nerf. They're just doing it just to make the deck slightly weaker, essentially. And of course, in Arena, it was already pretty hard to draft this because, you know, if you had any non-frost spells, it jeopardizes the ability to actually get the trigger, which is very, very important to get that free consecration. And you usually didn't really want to go double frost anyways, so you usually weren't even, at least I never really did, so I was never really offered this anyway. You would still take it, of course, if you went like triple frost or something, but especially if you're mixed and you're not getting the effect, then this becomes just a bit worse. But even then, I mean, draw 2, 6 mana, 3/6, not that bad still, but yeah, again, just makes it a little bit weaker. That we move on to the last one, which I'll talk about really quickly because this is not really an arena card, but Twig as well. This was nerfed for wild. Instead of just gaining 10 mana crystals, it now refreshes your mana crystals. So I'm assuming that that pretty much destroys the card. This was just completely wreaking havoc on wild, so that's pretty much no longer a thing, I believe. So I guess that's good. And with that, we move on to the next section, which is all of the buffs here. And there were like, I don't know, what was it, like 21 or something? There are a whole lot of them, so I'll try to go through them relatively quickly. A lot of these cards are just getting a little bit cheaper. Some of them, I mean, in the case of the first one, Rockmaster Voon here, this is a strict buff, but some of them, they're just becoming like smaller versions of themselves, having their stats adjusted in addition to the cost. So some of these aren't really even buffs for Arena, but, you know, as we'll get to those when we get there. First one, Rockmaster Voon, going from a 4 mana 4/3 to a 3 mana 4/3 that still copies a minion of each minion type in your hand. So a totally vanilla statted minion that also generates somewhere between usually like 1 to 4 cards maybe. So yeah, it's just really, really good. It is a legendary, so there are stronger legendaries still probably, but yeah. This is a very significant buff for that card. I should mention there's like, I think there are like 5 or 6 total changes for Warrior, so there's going to be a significant buff for Warrior through all this, because they're also buffing 2 of the rifts. They are buffing the cheap rift from 2 mana to 1 mana, which, you know, just makes it into an actual claw rather than a 2 mana claw, which is obviously a pretty significant change because it makes it at least like it approaches draftability just for the card itself. You probably still wouldn't pick claw almost ever, but of course, you probably should be willing to do it for the upside of being able to trigger the finale to play your last rift. One thing I should mention though is that the one awkward thing is that at 1 mana this is probably a little bit harder to actually get the finale of, so it might not actually be a pure buff to be totally honest, but you know, usually it should be, right? Hopefully you can make it work. Because the other rift being buffed is also Bridge Rift. This was a 6 mana, 3/4 and a 4/3, so 7/7 worth of stats, half with Rush, half with Taunt. Now it's a 5 mana version of the exact same card, so it's just super, super efficient all of a sudden. It was already fine by itself, and now it's just insane by itself, and then there's the fact that you can also double it, so it's just very, very crazy. And one thing I should mention as well, which maybe a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of, is that Bridge Rift is currently the most common card in Warrior. I know it's an epic, but it's still the most common card. This Blizzard chose to make it this way, so you should probably be picking every rift. Maybe not necessarily the smaller rifts if you're later on in a draft and you didn't actually get the bridge rifts, but usually you get the bridge rifts, you should probably assume it, and it's probably just worth taking every rift you see, basically. So that is the meta Blizzard wanted, I guess. So moving on to the next card being buffed is Power Slider. Power Slider was a 3 mana 1/2. Now it is gaining +1/+1, very significant buff. It's still 3 mana, and it still gains +1/+1 for each minion type you played this game. So that is a very, very significant buff. You usually have a couple minion types just on accident without even trying, and it's pretty likely even that you might just have a 1 or a 2 drop with Tribe, and then this becomes a 3 drop automatically. A 3/4 Rush is very, very good for 3 mana. There's the potential, obviously, that it continues to grow later, so yeah, this goes from a pretty not super draftable card to a very, very good card that you'd probably just be happy to pick up. Still maybe not the best card in the game, obviously, but you know, it definitely makes it a solid and good card. Next up, the other buff we have for Warrior, there is one more after this as well, is Shield Block. Shield Block was, it was too expensive for what it did, frankly, right? So now it's just going to 2 mana. That's still not really going to make it a great arena card, but it makes it a bit more pickable, right? Especially if you actually do have armor synergy, it might be worth considering now. You still probably wouldn't draft it over a lot of things, but it's, again, just a little bit more pickable, so not terrible. The last one we have here, there's actually another one for Warrior after this as well. This one's Flight and Flunky. This one was already a very good card in Arena. It was a 2-mana 2/2 with Taunt that discovers another Taunt minion. And as with the trend of a lot of things, you don't really have to pay any price to get Discover, so you are now getting a 2-mana 2/3. Instead of a 2-mana 2/2, you no longer have to pay a price for Discover. So yeah, just a very, very good card that's just made even better. It's now probably one of the better cards in Warrior, period. Not as good as Bridge Rift, but you know, pretty darn good. And the last one we have here is Thoribalor. This is a 4-mana 4/4 elemental beast with Rush and Death Rattle Dormant. Cast a fire spell to revive Thoribalor. It used to be that you could only revive it up to twice. Once you revived it twice and it died, it would just go away. But now that has gone away, you can actually just respawn this thing infinitely. So it was pretty darn unlikely you ever actually did that in Arena. You ever respawned it 3 times. And other than that, there's no change to the card. So this is a very, very small buff. It almost never will matter in Arena. But if you happen to have a whole bunch of fire spells, hey, man, maybe you want to take this. But with that, we will move on to the next class here. There are a couple changes for Mage. The first one here is Infantize the Maxitude. I was really scared when they saw they were buffing this, that they were putting it to 1 mana. They are not. However, now this is 2 mana, still 2 mana discover a spell, but it also reduces the cost by 1, and it still functions the same way. If you finale it, you get to do this infinitely. It is very significant, though, that they're putting mana cheat on this, because that does mean, very critical thing is that you can actually now play a 1 mana spell if you discover it here. So you can finale this, but then not actually really use it as finale. You might actually be able to have initiative of some kind with it as well. And of course, as well, if you happen to get some big spell, you might even be able to mana cheat it. For example, you play Arcane Defenders on turn 7 that you had discovered at any point earlier on in the game. It's just, yeah, it's a pretty darn significant buff. This card was obviously very good already, and yeah, now it's just better. And so next up we move on to Audio Splitter. This is the first one of these changes I kind of alluded to earlier, where they're just kind of making the card a smaller version of itself, which isn't even really necessarily a buff in Arena. This is going from a 3-mana 4/3 to a 2-mana 3/2. I do think a 2-mana 3/2 is probably better than a 3-mana 4/3. 3-mana 4/3 is just, there's a lot of ways to deal 3 damage, so they get dealt with pretty easily. So I do think this is still a buff, but really this isn't that much of a change, period, for Arena. And next up we have Spitelash Siren. This was a 5-mana 2/6 Naga. It's being changed to a 4-mana 2/5 that still does the same thing, which is after you play a Naga, refresh 2 mana crystals, then it switches to spells. So then if you can keep, the idea would be that you keep changing between Naga and spell and you get just a whole bunch of mana cheat. In Arena, you just don't really have enough Nagas and spells to ever really do this. It would be a lot better if it started on spells, so at least you could always get the mana cheat, but a lot of times you just don't have a Naga. So this thing is largely undraftable, and it's not really getting any better as far as Arena is concerned. Obviously, in Constructed, you can have earlier pop-off turns. It's a pretty significant change, but in Arena, it's kind of a nothing. Next up, we have Arcane Artificer. This is going from a 1-mana 1/2 elemental to a 1-mana 1/3. At a 1-mana 1/2, it was just very unimpactful. It wasn't really worth drafting all that much. A lot of times you would generate it randomly off of Synthesize or whatever that 1-mana generate elementals card is. But now as a 1-mana 1/3 it's just a whole lot better on turn 1, which makes it, I think, a lot more draftable than it was. And again, you're buffing Synthesize or whatever it's called as well, because a lot of times it would just generate this. So this, I do think, is a pretty significant buff to this card. It's going to help Mage's ability to stay alive, which is something they do struggle with sometimes. And with that, we move on to the next class, which is Hunter. The first change here is that Stranglethorn Heart is going from 10 mana to 8. That is a very significant change if you can have really any kind of big beasts, or any mid-range beast. If you can play a couple beasts early on, you might just be able to play this on turn 8 and have it actually be pretty good. And I think that does make it a lot easier to justify picking, because it will just be not just more efficient, but also be able to get it out early. But obviously, you know, this is still a synergy card that you just don't always get the synergy for, so I wouldn't automatically pick this just because it was buffed. But, you know, again, just be on the lookout. If you get offered it, just check, do I have a bunch of big beasts or not? And then in that case, it will be quite quite lovely. That's still probably not a card you want in most decks, but it's tradable, so, you know, it's never completely useless. Just you probably have better legendaries most of the time. Talking about better legendaries, the next one we have here is Halderon Brightwing. This card is getting, I think, a change that it definitely needed. This was really weird because it was a 3-mana 3/4, give arcane spells. Previously, it was only spells in your deck, spell damage +1. It was very weird because it didn't buff your hand, so a lot of times it would do literally nothing, because if you just didn't draw your spells, then it just didn't work. So now it also buffs your hand, which is a pretty significant change. If you have, you know, like that card draw spell, Conjured Arrow, in your hand, it gets buffed as well, so that's very, very significant. And with that, we're moving on to the next class, which is Shaman. Shaman I'm not super happy to see buffed just because Shaman was arguably already the best class in Arena, so now the balance is going to get worse. Because the first one we have here is Jazz Base. This was the 3-mana 2/2 weapon that if you overload while equipped, you keep getting more and more mana cheat potentially. Now it's just a 3/2 weapon, and you know, it's a 3-mana 3/2. Effectively, though, it's a 2-mana 3/2 because it already comes with a mana cheat attached to it. So this is just like a really good Fiery War Axe as a base, and it gets even better later on. So yeah, this is just a really, really good card all of a sudden. It was already like semi-pickable, but now it's just really good. So that's a huge buff for Shaman there. Next card we have here is Altered Chord. This was a 5-mana Lifesteal deal 5 that was 2 mana if you were overloaded. Now they're giving an extra attack, so now it's basically like a Death Strike from Death Knight, but if you are able to overload, it's way, way cheaper. If you're not, it's a little bit more expensive. It's a pretty significant change because even if you were gonna kill the thing anyway, you still at least gain an extra health potentially from this, so it's always going to be a small improvement unless you're full health, obviously, but yeah, it's just it's a strict improvement to a card that was already this was like a okay pickable card. Right now it's just it's a bit better. It still just doesn't change it by that much, but especially if it overload, it's a great card. Next one we have here is Flow Rider. This was a 2-mana 3/2 with the text that if you're overloaded, discover a spell from your deck. It's now going to a 1-mana 2/1, which is a little bit weird because a 1-mana 2/1 is definitely worse than a 2-mana 3/2 in Arena. So this is probably a nerf. But there are some nice things you can do that if you, for example, overload on turn 1, you play like a Lightning Bolt or that 3/2 that overloads you 1, then you can play this on turn 2. So it fits in really nicely in that particular circumstance, but other than that, you probably would rather have a 2-mana 3/2 than this. So honestly, this is more of a nerf, I think, than anything. But that's just as far as Arena is concerned. In Constructed, you tend to just like to be able to do more things, so this will be better because you don't actually care about your board and things in Constructed, right? But in Arena, I think it's a nerf, but this one, which is not a nerf at all, is Lightning Storm. Is going from Overload 2 to Overload 1, which just means, I mean, Lightning Storm was already a really good card in Arena, and the Overload did sting, but it was worth it it was a price you wanted to pay because the AoE would be often so important. So you would usually pretty much always take it, and now, I mean, you're even more going to pretty much always take it because now it is just insanely efficient as well. Triggers all those overload synergies at a low price as well, yeah, so it's just a very, very good card. And with that, that is it for Shaman. There are also a bunch of buffs for Warlock. So for Warlock, they are getting a few of their Fatigue package cards buffed. The first one here is Crescendo. This was a 3-mana AoE. Now it's a 2-mana AoE, which takes fatigue damage and deals that much to all enemies. This one is still a little bit weird because you still have to... It's not really worth it just for one. It's still... So you want to have a little bit of synergy to pick this anyway, but of course it's a pretty significant buff from where it was. If you already had one trigger, then this is definitely worth it now. But again, just be a little bit careful because it's just not worth it by itself. And the other one they're buffing as well in the fatigue package is the big win condition, the Crazed Conductor. This is going from a 5-mana 4/5 to a 4-mana 3/4. This one I also don't really think is a very meaningful change. I mean, okay, yeah, if you go fatigue card into 4-drop, yeah, that's a pretty significant buff, but a lot of the times, you know, you're going to want to play this later to let yourself find some of your fatigue cards first anyway. So doing this a little bit earlier probably just isn't worth that much most of the time, and if anything, it just makes it a little bit more vulnerable to AoE, so this might honestly again be a nerf as much as it is a buff, or even more. But of course, again, it's going to have its moments. Warlock is what I have currently pegged as the worst class, so you're still probably not, this isn't going to be enough to make you want to play Warlock, but it is a bit of a change, and as well, they are buffing one more card in Warlock, which was Siphon Soul. Siphon Soul really did seem admittedly overpriced at 5 mana. So now they are bringing it down to 4 mana to yet again have one additional power crept version of Assassinate in the game. Isn't it funny that Assassinate is still in the game and they have so many other power crept Assassinates, but you know, this is still almost always worse than Cannibalize, so it's just kind of funny there. But this definitely will be a pretty significant buff for Arena. It was a little bit expensive at 5, and at 4 this thing becomes a lot more pickable, so this is going to be a pretty significant buff for Warlock. And with that, we'll move on to the next class. There are still multiple classes left with a few changes here. This one is Rogue. Rogue, their weapon as well is being buffed. It's going from a 3 mana 2/2 weapon to a 3 mana 3/2 weapon yet again, and this one as well starts out with a mana cheat. So this is again the same efficiency as buffed for pre-nerf Fiery War Axe. And as well, if you get some combo cards, you can get some pretty significant mana cheat out of this. It's not super likely because usually it's hard to really go for combo cards too much in Arena, but you know, if you get like that combo card that generates other combo cards, there is some potential you can get some pretty significant mana cheat out of this. In any case, at the very least, you could view this as essentially a much better version of Deadly Poison most of the time. So it goes from a card that you probably didn't want to draft to a card that you'd be pretty happy to draft. And as well, the other rogue card being buffed is MC Blingtron. This is going from a 5 mana 3/4 to a 5 mana 5/5. Pretty significant. Still has the same text, where you also increase damage dealt to your opponent potentially for 2 turns if they can't destroy their own weapon. And you basically get a free dagger as well. And so this is definitely enough of a change. I don't think I've ever seen actually anyone play this, but definitely getting that additional stats is very significant in Arena, so that makes this a lot more of a pickable card than it was. I still doubt I would consider it like a super premium legendary, but especially in aggressive deck, you'd be pretty happy to do this. Because again, as well, that's when you want the effect the most, but also you're hopefully not daggering on 2, so you have an empty weapon slot and you actually get some upside out of that as well. So I think that makes it a pretty significant buff, and as well, it is a mech, so you can see this as well off of like a mech discover if you happen to have an amalgam or something, so that's something to think about as well. Moving on, next we have Priest. So Priest is having a really funny change, because what they're doing is they are buffing Holy Nova again, kind of, because they're making it 1 mana cheaper, but once again it can no longer hit the enemy face. I find it really funny that they, like, for example, won't make arena specific rules because they think it's confusing, but then they do stuff like this, like they're flip-flopping the functionality of Holy Nova. So once again, it's going to be very confusing to people that, you know, that Holy Nova in my hand is not lethal, guys. But yeah, I can't even blame you at this point, right? Because it's like, yeah, this is just super confusing, but very important to note that Holy Nova no longer goes face for the enemy. Probably the most significant change to be like consciously aware of here. With that, that is it for Priest. Now there are a couple changes for Druid. The first one here is Kiri, Chosen of Elune. This was a card that was really not great when it came out. It was a 4 mana 2/2, which is very expensive. It drew you effectively 2 cards, the Solar Eclipse and a Lunar Eclipse. Even in Arena, it wasn't really great at 4 mana because it was just so slow, and this thing being a 3 mana 2/2 definitely makes it quite a bit better. Particularly since the Solar Eclipse does kind of give you like mana cheat as well, it makes this a lot more draftable, I think, because you're just not paying that much of a tempo penalty anymore. So a pretty significant buff for sure, but you know, it's a legendary, you don't really see it, but yeah, you should be thinking about this one at least a lot more than you used to. There's still probably better legendaries, but particularly if you have things you might want that Lunar Eclipse for the double cast of a spell, then this might be pretty good for you. And the last adjustment here, this is actually the last buff. We finally reached the end. This is Death Blossom Womper, going from a 6 mana 7/6 to a 5 mana 6/5. Again, one of those changes that I guess 5 mana 6/5 is probably better than a 6 mana 7/6. I don't know. It's arguable. You get to do it a turn earlier, so you're slightly less likely to draw your death rattle that you might have before you play this, so that's pretty cool. But yeah, overall, not really a big significant change for Arena. So yeah, that is it for these changes. There are also like a whole bunch of Battlegrounds changes, which I'm not going to go into. into because I haven't really been playing Battlegrounds, so I'm not familiar really. There's a whole bunch of duels updates as well. I'll put this link into the description of the video if you want to go through all of this yourself, of course. But the one other thing I will mention in the bug fixes section particularly is that there were some functionality adjustments, or bug fixes I guess you would say, between Arcanite, Ripper, and Screaming Banshee. Particularly, one of the weird things, the most arena relevant thing, was that Screaming Banshee, when you would attack into an enemy minion, for example, so you take damage and heal at the same time with the lifesteal weapon, you wouldn't actually get the full 5/5, you would only get like however much you net healed, and they're adjusting that, so now you should always get a 5/5 if you attack with the Ashbringer specifically. And in the same way with Arcanite Ripper, if you somehow manage to heal and take damage at the same time, you actually get the changes where you wouldn't have before. But other than that, there are no other changes for Arena. It's still possible. I'm hoping they do an adjustment soon, please, Blizzard, but like sometimes they do a hotfix like the day after, so tomorrow on Friday there's a chance they'll do it, but for now we will be waiting and seeing. And oh yeah, I should mention as well, I almost forgot that I need to make my adjustments to this tier list here that I mentioned in the beginning. So Shaman got pretty significant buffs, but Shaman was already potentially the best class, so Shaman is still very likely to be one of, if not the best class. And it's too early to tell right now, but it's very possible that's enough to put Shaman on their own tier. I'm not sure that it is though. For now, I'm going to keep them at the top tier. The one class I will be dropping down is Death Knight, because Death Knight had some pretty significant nerfs to their discovers. They're still good, but I think they're just not quite in the top tier anymore. But what I do think will be in the top tier now is Warrior, because Warrior, with those really cheap rifts and some of those other buffs they had as well, Warrior's definitely going to shoot up in tier 1. I was checking the win rates earlier and it's already shot up pretty significant. There's a chance that Warrior is just the best class in the game as well. We will have to see. But with that, I'm going to be keeping pretty much everything else the same. The one adjustment I will make as well is that I'm at least like optimistically hoping that Warlock will at least move up to the level of the other bad classes, essentially, with all of those the buffs to Siphon Soul perhaps being the most significant one, but also the fatigue buffs as well. And so I do expect that this will be pretty safe to be what the tier list will be. If I make any adjustments to this tier list, which maybe I'll comment below the video if I make any adjustments, the one adjustment I might make would be to drop basically everything down, and then if Shaman or Warrior is particularly dominant, then put it at its own tier in the top. But currently I think this is going to be it until Blizzard chooses to make adjustments. When they will or won't, who knows, but I do think they will at some point. It's a question of when, not if. But with that, I'd be really interested to hear what you think about all of these changes. Let me know in the comment section below. Of course, thanks a lot for hanging out, everyone. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and all those things. Thanks a lot again. We'll see you guys in the next one.